it's not as cool as in person.
I agree. Okay, so it's 10:15.
Yeah, let's go.
Hello everyone. Thank you for joining us from your homes all around the world to attend DataCon LA 2021. Um, let's give Peter Zaitsev, CEO and founder of Percona, of a big DataCon LA welcome. My name is Aaron, your host, and co-hosting with me today is Chijioki Ejimuda, or CJ for short. We'll be moderating the chat and Q&A for everyone that's joining the session. So I would like to give a brief background on Peter. So Peter comes from having been involved in the open source database industry for more than 20 years. And from Peter, he says, quote, getting MySQL security is an important, though often overlooked part. And this part made me chuckle a bit. He says also, screwing it up is not how you want your company to make it to the front page. Nice. Very quotable. And so I would say today's very special as Peter will be talking about the state of MySQL security in 2021. Without further ado, I would like to present to you Peter Zaitsev.
Okay, well, thank you for a nice intro. And indeed, we're going to talk about MySQL security. And security in general is this very interesting and fascinating topic for me. I came from a performance optimization background, and finally, frankly, that's where more of my expertise lies. But security is interesting is because where with performance optimization, you kind of always win some, you lose some. If something doesn't work, you just try it again, right? If something was a bad idea, you can roll it up. And if you screw up once or twice, it doesn't quite matter. If security, though, that is, when you screw up big, you may not have a second chance, right? There are a number of companies you will find in the industry which had a many $billion fines or the market impact, or even went out of business because of some issues of security. And just a couple of days ago, there was this interesting stats came out from the security researchers about really how bad security is of databases. They talk about on-prem databases here, but do not think what the cloud database are all absolutely secure, right? And even if a number is not that high, we can see what there is still work to do. Now, why database security and MySQL security in particular? Because I think the databases is this really the pure pot of gold for hackers. That is where you have all your data, and it's in a wonderfully convenient, easy to process space, right? So if you really got the database hacked, it is fantastic for bad guys and very bad for you. So it's probably not a surprise that we can see the number of data breaches, number of record leaks, number of kind of very sensitive data such as healthcare data breaches have been increasing year over year. And if one thing I want to take away for you is to what you need to make sure your data is well protected, whatever database it is in. And in this presentation, of course, I'm going to focus on MySQL. Specifically, I want to talk about the key risks you may see for breaches, roles and their responsibilities, and then finally what MySQL has to offer specifically in 2021. I'm not going to cover all the MySQL security features, but just focus on the stuff which is new. Now, one thing about security, which I found interesting, is what you have both kind of compliance drivers and the practical needs. For certain things, you will have folks from compliance, government agencies or whatever, and say, hey, you guys have to follow this HIPAA regulation or some other one, and that is what you wanted to do. In this case, you often do not have a lot of field for creativity, right? You just have to comply with certain stuff. In other cases, it is the practical needs where you just need to be secure, but hopefully not causing a lot of inconvenience just because you do not want to be hacked. And if you look at organizations, different drivers are more prevalent. Some of them are really focusing, hey, you just want to have those compliance folks off our backs. Other focus on the practical security needs. And in my opinion, that is where you really want to make sure you that take both covered, because being non-compliant as well as go and hack can have a very bad results for your organization. If you look at the security attacks for modern time and day, we have can prove them in a couple of big groups. One of them is generic. There is a lot of bots running around internet which are just finding known security holes and trying to hack something, or in many cases just automatically implant some ransomware to break it. And they are looking for sort of an easy marks in this case, if you like. And the good thing about that is just relatively general hygiene allows you to really prevent most of those. If you know, for example, about the targeted security attacks, if somebody really wants your data hacked, it's much more sophisticated and harder to avoid. That is where you often have a lot of people doing, social engineering or other tricks, which is very hard to really avoid. With that, I think it's very important as you're thinking practically about security is to manage risk and understand what it is not possible to eliminate them completely. As you may have seen in the modern press, we see some of the most sophisticated and secure organizations have been hacked at some times, right? So you want to make sure that you also have a multiple layers of security to assist with that, and also do not underestimate physical and people aspects, right? I think for us, the engineers working with different software, we tend to focus on how to make our software secure, while the physical access and really people often remain weakest links. One of the framework to approach security in general is this, which I think is a very valuable way to think about that. One is assess. That's how you understand the risks. Then you, of course, focus on prevention, right? And that's where you make sure you have secure account, encryption, and so on and so forth. The next one goes in detect. That means as well, if incident happens, how we can catch it promptly. Maybe when it's just starting and their bad guys haven't been able to get access to most important data or download a lot of data. And then there is a question of recover, right? How can you ensure to reduce or eliminate outage caused by the breach, reduce business impacts, and so on and so forth, right? And a lot of that will be how your security folks are focusing about them, and maybe as DBAs or database developers, you will participate in only some of those. But I think it's a very good to really understand the overall framework, how business may be looking at security. Now, here are the risks which I think is very is very handy to cover. That doesn't is not a complete risk, but these are the ones which I'm going to cover in my presentation. So first, let's talk about the application vulnerability. Right, the thing about the application is what any application really has bugs, or any complicated ones, and some of those bugs can be exploited by the bad actors. As we have seen with SolarWinds Hub, for example, it is not just the application itself, but the build process or update process can be compromised if the backdoors inserted in the application. right? And that is where you really need to make sure your development, build, the deployment practices are in line with such actors in mind. One of the things you can also do in this case to reduce the impact is to run application with minimum privileges needed. So even if your application is compromised some level in some level, they have a minimal impact, and also monitor application behavior. So if application is doing something what it's not supposed to be doing, then you can really be alert and act on that. The other big problem besides the application is what your application really runs in this broad ecosystem, where all the different components may also have bugs, and some of them can be used for security employees. Operating system was known to be something what can often have problematic bugs. More recently, we have seen some other software components being potentially security issues, right? If you remember over the last few years, there have been variety of bugs actually in the CPU, which would allow to kind of bypass their CPU protections and isolations we felt so natural. And then there have been various other uh, components ranging from BIOS to APMI interface which have been hacked. The infrastructure provider also have a lot of stuff running which may be compromised, as well as frameworks, components, libraries your application may be using. I think that is important, though, to really understand what the security and the bugs do not only come from the code what you implement, but also from all that kind of supply ecosystem what you are using. The next thing to talk about is the SQL injection, which is obviously a type of security bug in the application, which allows you to insert the unintentional queries in the application, which really allows intruder to steal or destroy data. The approaches to dealing with SQL injections would be properly sanitizing data wherever it comes from, right? I think what is important here is what even if data comes from a database or something where you think you put it, it still needs to be sanitized, because otherwise that can be another vector for intruders kind of to modify the data in the database, right, some way, and then cause another application to misbehave. Using the prepared statements, even if they're emulated prepared statements, can be quite helpful. And I also would pay special attention to the dynamically generated queries, because that is typically that's where a lot of complexity or more complexity, and so more ways to screw things up. Now, SQL injection is something which has been here for, well, as long as I remember, right? But I think it's very interesting to see what that is a still top issue when it comes to web application security risks, right? You can check this OWSAP project for other items as well. So that's, I think, but the fact that SQL injection is still on top of there, I think is very interesting. Finally, if you need some other motivation for SQL injection, I wanted to share that little comic with you, which you may have seen. If not, that can be very motivating thing to share with some of the maybe more junior database developers who do not really understand importance of preventing database SQL injections and their role in that. Application server hacks. That is another thing which I think happens very common. Application server often is closer to attacker than a database server, so it can be easier to get into. It also have a different attack surface compared to the database servers. I think what is very good to think in this case from your layered security standpoint, what does it mean if attacker has a full access to a database to application server, and see how you can limit what that can happen to the database. Again, that happens to the good practice is to limit access to the credentials, right? Credentials to access the database on a database server has good local account security, right? So that means your application server there hopefully is not running under root account, right? So um, it doesn't give a full access to a box even if it hacked, and and also auditing of course is important. So if your application server starts to misbehave, then you get alert on that quickly. Direct access to the database server, that I think is interesting, right? Because typically, or in a lot of cases, database server is hacked because it is exposed directly to the internet, right? Which is a pretty bad configuration mistakes. Sometimes folks misconfigure firewall. Sometimes just it's placed in the cloud and exposed kind of for convenience, and so on and so forth. But the idea is what you really want to avoid that, and also understand what if your database server is really completely compromised, then that is pretty bad the situation. What you also want to do is to monitor for known vulnerabilities and update properly. It is mind-boggling, for example, for me to look at the WordPress stats websites and see what there are a whole bunch of people still running MySQL 5.1 or 5.5, which have been years since they went end of life, and they have a lot of known unfixed security vulnerabilities. So if you just have those servers exposed to their internet, then they are ripe for the taking. So yeah, don't expose your servers to the database servers to internet. Keep recent versions, and again, try to monitor their behavior to spot if it's ever compromised. Network traffic, that is another interesting attack vector. Now, if you look at your client in a database, there is probably a lot of very sensitive information going back as a queries and as a result sets back. And if that is not secured, then attacker can reconstruct a lot of the database stuff from that if they choose so, as well as potentially recover some data, which can help them to access the database. So the approach here is quite simple. What you want to encrypt the traffic between the database and the application server. Now, what is important there, though, is if you look at the modern CPUs and if you use modern, TLS libraries, then such encryption can be done quite cheaply, right? We have a lot of folks who are encrypting all their database connection, and they're still able to achieve very good performance. Test database is another very interesting vector because test databases in many cases are basically done as dump of your production database as a part of those. And that means it may contain a lot of confidential data, which is being test database can be a lot more loosely protected. Now, the recommendation would be, in this case, to ensure your test database has no sensitive data, right? Basically, you use some anonymization, right, or whatever to clean up FSH data. But if it's not possible for one reason or another, then you have to take a very simple rule, right? I mean, if that contains sensitive data, then you cannot take it as a test database from secure. That you need to take it as a production database from security standpoint and offer the same protection principles. Backups and database dumps, that is another very common vector, right? And why is that? Because while your production database is, just kind of one thing and exists in a single instance, you can look at it, kind of monitor it, right? There may be many copies of backups, and you can take a copies of copies, right? And that means it's kind of can be much harder to keep a track of. The approaches for that to secure backups are the following. One is you, of course, want to secure backup storage, especially in the cloud. There are so many database breaches happen because people put their backups on S3 because that's wonderfully convenient, but then they do not have S3 buckets properly secured, right? Maybe developer open it up so he can download the backup in some, third-party location which is not connected to VPN or something and forgot to lock it back or whatever. You want to encrypt the backups, right? And you also do not want to store keys to give you backups. That is also some thing that you find often done kind of for convenience, where a backup is encrypted, but you kind of have a key right there in the lock, which doesn't really have. And then also disposing of the backups properly, including backup media, is another important things. You'll find number of cases when people will just find sensitive information just by buying old hard drives or something on eBay and find they're, well, not even properly wiped. Okay. Now with that, let me move on to the roles and responsibilities of your team. And as I was thinking of that, I can only say, well, it is quite complicated. If you go from like startups to some large enterprises, you may find from essentially one person being jack of all trades, from development to operations to security, to the massive organizations where there may be multiple groups, compliance, security, operations, DBAs, whatever, right? Which kind of have a shared responsibility for securities. One way to look at that would be relatively simple. You can say, well, there are folks, which are developers, who are developing the code, right, in the application. And then there is all that operations folks, you can call DBA, sysadmins, or cloud operations, whatever, which run that code in production. And I think what is important in this case is to really um, understand what security is really a team sport. You cannot have either application team or operation team just to guarantee security all alone. And that is where I have seen number of problems happening, right? Application team saying, hey, you know what? We just don't care about security. We're writing this application and we have very strong sysadmin, SecOps, right? Or whatever teams will just take care of that. Well, no, they won't, right? If you have the very kind of buggy code which allows everybody uh, to get into your application, your security inevitably would be compromised. Okay, well, enough with generalities. Let's now talk about some of more specifics. MySQL in 2021. MySQL in 2021 is MySQL 8.0. And what is interesting about MySQL 8.0 is this is kind of evergreen release, right? Right. Every new version of MySQL 8 introduces some features. Since first GA MySQL release, there have been number of new security features introduced. So what I'm covering here is a current version of MySQL 8, which you probably should be running. And I expect a future version of MySQL 8 are likely to have even more security features added, because I think that is one of the areas of the MySQL team was really working very hard. Unfortunately, not all of the features are available in an open source MySQL. Some are restricted only to the enterprise version. But well, at least it's great to see that that is a focus. First, MySQL has roles support finally. Roles are part of a SQL standard, but MySQL didn't have them before, right? So the idea of roles is twofold. One, instead of granting permission to every account, you can create roles and assign them to account, kind of simplifying your permission management. Another interesting thing is what you can have a single account switching its roles during the operations, and through that, really being able to escalate or adjust the privileges it needs for even more secure control. This is example how you can use MySQL role, right? And you can see you sort of create roles and you can assign permissions to the role just as you would do that for a normal user account. And then you can create a user and assign a role or set of roles to that user. Next, let's talk about the TLS, transport level security. That is how you encrypt your network connections, which is not really new in MySQL 8 on its own. It has been in MySQL for a while, but it has been getting a lot of polish and improvements in MySQL 8. Like, for example, you can set an option such as recur secure transfer to only accept secure connections. And secure connections, that means either TLS or you can access MySQL through local Unix socket, right, which is done within constraints of a single system, so it doesn't require encryptions. You can configure chippers, which are allowed, as well as a TLS version, because again, here, based on the compliance standard and security issues discovered, you may not, you may want to log down to some particular versions. Another improvement, which is quite cool in MySQL, is what you can now reconfigure TLS without restarting the server. That is helpful, for example, if your server-side certificate is about to expire and you want to update it, but you cannot take downtime. Here are some of the examples for TLS. For example, we can require TLS, and you see MySQL use kind of an old language of SSL, but kind of in this case, for this context, that is basically the same thing. You can require certificate authentication for a user with require X509. And you can also control what kind of chippers you require for particular user, or even require issuer in certificate. And that is one of the ways how you can set up authentication with certificates rather than a username and the password. Another improvement in MySQL is what is called dynamic privileges. And this is something like database internal things more than user facing, but I think it's important both for plugin developers as well as admins. Classically, your standard privileges was it was hard to add them and impossible to add from plugins in extensions. So that means if you are writing an extension, let's say for monitoring, you would be relying on the super privileges. So over years, for many monitoring applications, you would just grant the super privileges, and that became too big. Dynamic privileges, though, are privileges defined in a runtime, for example, by plugin when it's loads. Let's say if you are loading the plugin which support for backups, right? It may define privilege as backup admin, which you can then grant to those accounts who need to do a backup admin instead of super. What that means in MySQL 8 is much more fine-grained access to different tasks in the database for accounts rather than relying on super too much. New authentication. MySQL 8 also comes with an authentication called Custom SHA-2 password, which is a faster and more secure authentication. The thing about this, though, is all the clients may not support it and will require what's called MySQL native password mode instead. And that is fine to do that for specific users, but I would recommend you to only do it as a transition period and migrate to the new MySQL 8 authentication when you have a chance.
Hey, Peter.
Yes.
Sorry to cut you off mid-flow. So we're at that mark, 10 minutes prior to kind of closing,
Mhm.
and I was just hoping if you can take some questions or if you had a few more slides you still wanted to cover.
Oh, okay, okay. Yeah, I thought you guys would interrupt me if there's any questions. Yeah, that's fine.
Oh, no, it's no problem. So there was a question, and this was back on the when you were discussing about security,
Hmm.
kind of like the general overview. So this is from Chijioki, and
Hmm.
he asked, which of the security attacks are more prevalent, and which of them are most challenging to mitigate?
Yeah. Well, okay. So for prevalent security attacks, when it comes to database in particular, I would say what SQL injections are one of the most common, and then the other one is just simple finding open database server and kind of doing checking for basic password dictionary attacks, right, or something. That's how a lot of ransomware spreads, right? Just a bot which tries a lot of database servers. If it's able to pick a password, then download the database, encrypt it, drop it, right, and then ask to send the Bitcoin somewhere.
Nice. Yep. Um, cool. So I'll let you go ahead and continue. We have about 4 minutes left.
Oh,
Thank you.
4 minutes left. I have a whole 8 minutes left on my watch, didn't I? Okay. Okay, let's move quickly then. Okay, so the other approach or innovation in MySQL 8, we have now password policies, right, which is quite cool, right? And you guys can research more in the manual. Uh, Yet another piece is dual password, which I think is very cool, which allows us to have a password, have a primary and secondary password, which really helps with password rotation at scale. Because for many, password rotation was so painful, it would stick just to the same password for years. And well, guess what? If the same password is for years, there is a lot of chance it's going to be leaked some way or by someone. MySQL also supports the FIPS mode, right? And I think that is only important for number of like very high-end regulations, but just to be aware it exists. MySQL 8 also for InnoDB in particular supports full data at rest encryption on a MySQL side, which is uh, really cool. And I suggest you to enable that. It does not really take a lot of overhead for a variety of workloads. When you think about data encryption, you also have to think about the key storage, right? How are those key to encrypt the data is managed? And that is where MySQL has advanced key storage only provided in the MySQL Enterprise Edition, but Percona Server for MySQL allows you to use HashiCorp, the open source project, right, for compliant key storage. We mentioned backups. You want to not to forget to encrypt your backups. Again, your options are either MySQL Enterprise Backup, if you like paying Oracle lots of money, or you can use Percona Extra Backup, which is open source. If you're using the textual backups such as MySQL Dump, MySQL Dumper, or what's not, right, they also can be easily encrypted with variety of external tools. Just do not forget to do that. Then we go to the pluggable authentication. On the large scale, especially in an enterprise environment, often you do not want to have your passwords kind of spread out across tens of thousands of database nodes. And MySQL provides integration with PAM, LDAP, or Windows in a MySQL Enterprise. We also provide pluggable authentication for more in the most popular ways with LDAP and PAM in Percona server for MySQL. One of the things I mentioned is what you also want to, in secure environments, you want to make sure you have the audit of access so you can spot issues promptly. And that is where you have MySQL Enterprise Audit plugin or Percona Audit plugin if you're looking for open source realization. It will provide the records, for example, like this in example. And you can see it's not only auditing specific queries, but also events such as connection established, connection closed, and so on and so forth, right? And you can configure auditing for your needs to only audit some comments, some users, some connections, you name it. When I spoke about their data for testing and a data masking, there is also solution that in the MySQL 8 space. There is a MySQL Enterprise data masking plugin, and again, Percona Server for MySQL data plugin, data masking plugin, which is basically re-implementation of the same ideas in open source. Data masking is still kind of not automatic, right? Because, well, it's very hard for database to know what data is sensitive and how you mask it. So you kind of get a set of functions how to help you to mask and anonymize the data, but that is on you to implement views, right, or special queries, how you um, transition that anonymized data. Finally, I would mention the firewalling, right? Same as your network HTTP server, you can actually firewall database by blocking some queries, for example, which looks like SQL injection, so looks like not something the application should be doing. There is their MySQL Enterprise Firewall, which you can use for this purpose. Or if you are looking for open source solution, there is this very nice software project, Proxy SQL, which allows you to do a lot of the same things MySQL Enterprise Firewall allows, but just as an uh, open source and standalone application. Well, with that's all I had, and I think I still have a few minutes for questions.
Perfect. Awesome, Peter. That was very informative. Really, really good talk. You know, I really do agree when you say that it's kind of like security is a team sport. And I just want to know from your opinion, who would you say? So going back to that slide about, I forget where, but it says like the, let's see, backing up
Mhm.
the storing keys with backups.
Mhm.
Who would you say is like the biggest offender? Is that from like the test, like the test group, like the test devs, or
Well, I think it's kind of it depends, right? In this case, and I think in different organizations, you will often have a large uh, difference between how different security educated peoples are, right? I mean, you will find like mind-boggling how many people may, forget to lock the laptop screen, right, or steal those kind of a yellow post notes with a, key password you can still find glued to the walls, right, to the screens if you have been to the office, right? In this case, and this is kind of the same people who are not educated who may say, well, isn't that just inconvenient if I keep those things together, right? Uh, in this case, I think in general, like the developers may be less educated about security aspects than people who are closer to operations management, like DBAs and especially SecOps. But even those can
nice?
make those things either by accident or by
Right.
not knowing.
Good, good. That's yeah, very cool. So just two brief questions. I did notice that you have a GitHub for the Percona, and
Mhm.
is it okay if I post it somewhere in the chat, or if you want to post it? Let me see. Is it okay if I do post it though?
Oh yeah, yeah, of course.
Perfect. Yeah. And where can we find your slides? I think you had they're on a Google Doc
No,
somewhere.
I will send. I have a shared version of the slides, but that
Okay.
is not the up to date, right? I will send another version of slides. You guys can publish them
Perfect.
on a platform. And you share the GitHub. I think for a lot of stuff, you can also go like to percona.com. That is where you may want to download the packages, right, and find documentation. There
Yeah.
is a lot more stuff available out there.
Very cool. So in closing, I really do appreciate your time, Peter, and thank you so much for your presentation. I think there's a lot to gain, and from the value. And I really do agree that MySQL security is something that's very often overlooked. I appreciate all of the attendees for your questions, and please contact the speaker if you have any further questions regarding this topic. And feel free to provide comment and feedback to us or the organizers or the community board, and start a discussion and connect to the rest of the DCLA 2021 community. So thank you for joining today's presentation, and I hope you can gain some insight from the session. Have a wonderful day, and thank you for being a part of this year's DataCon LA.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, bye.
Bye.